I love the gray. I love it. I love it. It's great. It's great. Look, hey, I'm at the point. Look, I had to go blonde. Okay,
Yeah,
this is what happens when you get older. Like,
that's what happens at that
that's
point.
what happened. That's what happened. Because we don't gray in my family till we're like in our 80s. So,
Really.
oh
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. My father's just getting gray now, and he's 83. But it's mingled. He's still more black than gray.
Black and white. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So there you go. I think I'll pass out to see him gray, but here we go. Gonna come up in 5. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Santita Jackson Show here on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. We've got a lot to talk about. We're talking about this police state. How did we get here? We're seeing ICE, who are, according to press reports, being deployed in Chicago. What will that mean? Baltimore's supposed to be next. It could be a city near coming near you. What's going to happen in America? And the Supreme Court, in this context, and all of these decisions are made within a context. They said that it's okay to racially profile. That's happening too. And we're watching the federal troops deployed, the ICE, FBI, the National Guard. The rank and file are answerable to the president, but not the officers. The officers swear an oath to the Constitution. That's a very interesting distinction and difference. Well, it is in that context that we are watching what is happening in Chicago. Many people are saying that Chicago is really the great place where everything's going to be tested out here. Our mayor has put trucks all around the city blocking ICE from getting in. Oh, I love this city. This is how we do it in Chicago. That having been said, according to press reports, ICE has been deployed here. What will that mean? And what does it mean in a city where we had a mayor who we've seen on television now? He is being rehabilitated, but he was run out of office. And he was run out of office because of a boy who had been killed by the police. We all knew something had happened, but we could not get the videotaped evidence. We couldn't get it. But thankfully, this brilliant journalist was dogged in his investigations. Of course, he had a team, but he led a team that forced the hand. And we waited, Jamie Calvin, and we waited and we waited, and we saw the video of Laquan McDonald, two A's. We saw him shot to death, and the city has not been the same. Really, I just had Attorney G. Flint Taylor on in the previous hour, Fred Hampton's lawyer, the author of The Torture
Right.
Machine, where he tracks racism, and violence in the Chicago Police Department. And I see a through line here, Jamie. When we're looking at the police state, when we're watching the Supreme Court say it's okay to just pull people based upon what they look like, all of that, we're being deported to Africa and to South America, not to Europe, which
Yeah.
is interesting. But let's go back because I want people's memories to be refreshed about Laquan McDonald, because we're watching former Mayor Rahm Emanuel. He's getting another life. He became the ambassador to Japan, which is one of the most prestigious ambassadorial posts in all of the Foreign Service. He's now got a column at the Washington Post, one of the most prestigious newspapers in the Western world. He's on CNN offering up opinions about, he opines about everything. And yet it was this boy, it was the killing of this boy, a killing that he covered up, that pushed him out of office. Would you take us back to that? Because the
Yeah.
police, everybody's being deployed in the city in which that happened.
Right. And I think if you had Flint on in the previous hour, maybe it's worth going back to the day before Laquan McDonald was shot, or
Mhm.
more to the point, the day before the video was released.
Mhm.
That we had our own version of a police state in Chicago, in the sense that really the police could do no wrong. Uh, that it was very hard to challenge acts of police abuse. It was extraordinarily hard to get information about the internal operation of the police department. There the extraordinary work Flint and his colleagues did on John Birch and the history of torture, which goes on all these decades later, continues. Um, that sort of defined that era. We're talking about police torture. October 2014, and the incident was reported as pretty much routine. A teenage young man shot by the police, and the police account was that he lunged towards an officer with a knife. The officer had no choice but to shoot him to protect himself and his colleagues. How many times, you and I are lifetime Chicagoans, how many times we've had stories like that? And, they leave you feeling uneasy, and you turn the page. And we all do that. I mean, investigative journalists in Chicago, people working on civil rights cases. And it really was, I get a lot of credit for the reporting on Laquan McDonald. The real hero in this story is somebody in law enforcement who reached out with the information that, hey, that case last week of a police shooting, near Pulaski was in fact horrific. It wasn't at all what was reported. And critically, there's video. It was really the source that reported that there was video and that there was something worth looking at. And I think that person's motivation in reaching out, and to this day I haven't named them. I think their motivation was they were concerned that video would just disappear, be fixed. And he also provided information about a civilian witness to the shooting. Man, I can now name Jose Torres, who was just driving down Pulaski and had an unimpeded view of the incident. So, with that information, I undertook to report on the case, and ultimately was able to get the autopsy the moment it was, available to under Freedom of Information Act. And the autopsy disclosed that he had been shot 16 times, front and back, which completely contradicted the police narrative. And and in my reporting, made known the existence of the video, and also Mr. Torres ultimately agreed to talk with me, and his eyewitness description totally aligned with what we ultimately saw in the video. So, that moment, it's now more than 10 years, close to 11 years since McDonald was killed. This November, around Thanksgiving, will be marking a decade since the video was released. It took a huge upswell there was litigation and there was advocacy, but it was really people in the street demanding release of the video that I think forced the mayor's hand. And I had a conversation years later with Steve Patton, who was the corporation counsel, the chief lawyer for the city. And, that day when the court ruled that the video was to be made public, I left the courtroom along with seasoned reporters and civil rights attorneys, and we just assumed that the city would appeal and would, drag the process out for another 6 months or something. And in fact, within a matter of days, they released the video. And I asked Steve Patton years later, what goes there? What was the thinking? And he said, we just realized that we had lost control of the narrative. We'd lost control. So they made it.
What did he mean?
I think they made it. There was no way to put the genie back in the bottle. They had, it was just. When I wrote the initial article, and it now looks prophetic, I think it was just the way I closed the article. But I said something to the effect at the end, and this is fully a year before the release of the video, that when the video was ultimately released, people were going to be horrified by what they saw, but their horror was going to be compounded by the knowledge that the city had this information, knew what was in the video, and withheld it from the public for so long. And so I think what happened, the way I've sort of thought of it is less as a kind of discrete cover up. Think about Nixon and Watergate, and you know, political actors do something wrong. They know they've done something wrong. They try to cover it up. They falsify evidence, and they compound the harm. In this case, I actually think this is not a defense of Emmanuel, but it's just, I think, necessary context. And I think it's more disturbing than a cover up. If it's a cover up, you just, you charge the individuals, you vote them out of office. In this case, it was standard operating procedure. The way the case was handled was the way cases have been handled many, many times. The way, harms to Black Chicagoans at the hands of the police had just been made to disappear. And as I've sort of come to think about it, the consequence of the Emmanuel administration's repeated decision not to release the video while pressure is building and pressure is building and pressure is building, meant that when the video finally came out, it not only, disclosed definitively what had happened in this individual case, it just kind of blew up the whole narrative machinery, the machinery by which the city maintained control of the narrative or tried to control the narrative through controlling information. The whole thing blew up, and it created a kind of crater in our civic life that actually made reform possible. Just think about the cascade of events after that video came out. Police superintendent fired, the head of IPRA, the oversight agency, fired. The mayor appoints a task force headed up by Lori Lightfoot, to a police accountability task force. The Department of Justice comes in. Anita Alvarez, the attorney general, is voted out of office very much because she failed to charge the officer. So, just this amazing cascade, and then lots and lots of work over the years it's been slow, it's been imperfect, it's now imperiled, but, lots of work by lots of conscientious people to build out a kind of accountability infrastructure that really was meant to operationalize the lessons learned from this. And so, there is lots of unfinished business, but to give one example of something dramatic is 10 years ago, we had no expectation of transparency.
Yeah.
Now, not just in, the people who work on these cases, journalists and lawyers and such, the public, everybody expects to see the video. It's this universal expectation. But we'll get to the coming military occupation of Chicago. But it's against the background of this inch by inch effort to better understand and implement a regime of genuine accountability. Because things will always happen. It's a big, complicated city, 13,000 police officers. They're always going to, in the best possible future, there will be incidents that are concerning. Everything turns on how the government and the society as a whole respond when those things happen. And so, that's been the project that everybody's been involved in for the last decade. And now we have a regime in Washington to whom the idea of accountability in law enforcement is completely foreign. So it's pretty dramatic. A dramatic moment.
But that is why I wanted you to describe this, because I think that this is leading into the moment in which we find ourselves.
Absolutely.
Because you move forward, you take 2 steps forward, then the powers that be really push you back. And you have had this, I was fascinated when I read that you finish your father's manuscript, A Worthy Tradition, as you
Yeah.
were talking about freedom of speech in America. But because I have a father whose work I'm going to have to end up having to, there's some things that we'll have to complete for him. But
Yeah.
you're raised in this, right? And so to me, when I saw the Laquan McDonald case, to me that was about freedom of speech, because we saw how many people had been bought off to be silent.
Yeah.
So many people were silenced, right? I mean, you saw the machinery that was in place. Like you said, this could have gone just the way these things normally go, because someone's killed, family's paid off, boom, that's it. But this didn't happen that way. And there was an uneasy feeling about the killing of Laquan McDonald that really had the city and then the country. We said, no, no, we need to see the tape, because there was a buzz in the street on the ground that
Oh,
said,
it
no,
was
no,
big.
it was so huge. And it
It
still
was,
is quite, which is
yeah.
why I want to leave with this today.
Well, I
Because,
think, you know,
yes, please.
I'm sorry, not to talk over you. I think, I've often pondered why this case rather than another case, because since then, there have been dreadful police shootings, countless incidents before. And the analogy I draw is with Emmett Till.
Mm,
I think the video of Laquan McDonald was like the open casket of Emmett Till.
mm,
It was this portal into which people looked and saw fundamental issues about state violence against blacks and against the kind of saw a kind of Jim Crow legal regime.
mhm,
And but it's sort of uncanny when you think about how many incidents of this nature there have been.
mhm,
Think about all the lynchings in the era in the 50s when Emmett Till was brutalized and killed. And yet that story of a young man from Chicago, a teenager, a boy, a child, um, really, in some ways, was the an inflection point in terms of the emerging civil rights movement, and uh, struck the conscience of the nation in a way that all sorts of other incidents didn't. There was something similar with the Laquan McDonald case, at least within Chicago. Um, yeah, so and I think, I guess the other thing I wanted to respond to in what you said, one step forward, two steps forward, one step back. I think what we're confronting now really bears comparison to the um, reaction to the Reconstruction era.
how
The civil
so?
rights. Well, I think the civil rights movement and its extensions, and can be seen as a kind of second Reconstruction. And the folks who are in Washington now, and much of the Republican Party, and those who hold the levers of power now, have really been unreconciled to the advances made under the Warren Court and implemented by the Democratic um, administrations of that era, and they've really fought a long campaign, a really long campaign to utterly gut voting rights, um, uh, to lift constraints on law enforcement. And if I were, I'm not sure this is quite the right analogy, but I really think the aspiration of this administration is to reinstitute something that looks very much like Jim Crow. And you see the you see the campaign against brown people that we call immigration enforcement. And now in targeting cities like Chicago, Baltimore, Oakland, you see the campaign against black people that's called crime, you know,
Mhm.
fighting crime. Um, so Yeah, I mean, whatever was accomplished during this era, whatever it's going to be called, the Black Lives Matter era, we're seeing a huge backlash at the level of the federal government. And the question becomes the really interesting question, and I think there's lots of space for resistance and creativity, is how we respond at the state and local level, how we hold our ground in the face of this onslaught.
Well, as we face this onslaught, I see a through line here. And we've talked about this. Um, you've got Jim Crow, apartheid. You've got a police state, slave catchers. You have got ICE, who are being. You're seeing the Department of War, which was until the end of the Second World War, but it's been rebranded, launching a war on the American people in
Yeah,
anticipation of the American people exercising their right to speak freely. Hello.
yeah.
And about these cuts to the social safety net. I mean, is there, or am I reaching?
No, I don't think you're reaching. I would go a step further and say that the hope of the administration is that there will be resistance in the street, people exercising their rights, and almost always with mass demonstrations, there is some disorder and violence at the margins. They would love nothing more
Mhm.
than to invoke the Insurrection Act, to declare martial law. I mean, it's just sort of they're they're choreographing things to that outcome. My dad, as you mentioned before, was a legal scholar,
Mhm.
and he coined a term. He coined a term that has been much used in the law, that the heckler's veto. The heckler's veto. The idea being that um, somebody's giving a speech and there's um, violent counter demonstration, or but just think of it as an individual heckler trying to stop the speaker from speaking. The question is, at what point, as pressure builds, is it appropriate for the government to um, try to restore order by stopping the speaker, as opposed to stopping the heckler or the counter demonstrators? And there are lots of interesting. We all remember the sort of Skokie, not neo-Nazi
Mhm.
controversy. There, that's sort of a classic instance of that. But what we have now is the commander in chief, the president of the United States, is the chief heckler.
Mm.
He's the one trying to provoke, and it's an astonishing phenomena, that we've never seen anything like it.
But
He's
how, in this
provocateur.
moment, well, he is the provocateur. And my question then for you, as someone who has really fought for the freedom to speak freely and for transparency. I mean, you cannot have a republic, let alone
Yeah.
uh, democratic governance. You cannot have a republic without these things. You cannot have a republic without a free and protected press. Uh,
Yeah.
we don't have that. I mean, increasingly, all the things that make a republic don't exist anymore. And so, I mean, and the vote's unprotected, and fewer people. There are more and more barriers to the vote. How? What do we do? I don't want to be provoked into the people who go out to march. Jamie Calvin of the Invisible Institute, they are not marching. They're not rioters. It's,
Right.
this. It's the provocateurs. It's the saboteurs who are paid
Yeah.
by these government forces to do that. What are people to do? They can't just sit home and take this.
I think they march. I think they march. I think they speak out. I, you know, I mean, it's been widely noted that the failure of major media, of major educational institutions to stand up, it's really disturbing. The degree to which um, these major civil society institutions have sort of rushed to cut deals or accommodate with the administration is deeply, deeply disturbing. I think what we can learn from other situations elsewhere is that ultimately, there's so many different issues, and it's such a daily flood of disturbing news and all this histrionic performance by the administration. Um, I think it's helpful in the terms you were suggesting to think about this fundamentally as an assault on the First Amendment and on freedom of speech for each of us as citizens. This is an effort not to censor particular, uh, you know, particular points on the ideological spectrum. This is an effort by the Trump regime to impose a state ideology, and anything that doesn't align with that state ideology, uh, you know, right wing tending towards fascism, um, is is criminalized, is beyond the pale, and people simply can't accept that. And so there are a lot of models in of individuals acting really honorably in this moment, and there could be much more of people just your law firm may your law firm may cut an agreement with the government, but that doesn't mean you as individual lawyers have to. Your
Mm.
university may, but that doesn't, and I would hope that there'll be much more of that kind of resistance. But ultimately, this is about our ability to um, exercise freedom in living our lives, thinking our thoughts, loving who we love, um, uh, and it will just continue. It will continue. So the first order of business is just how do we hold our ground? How do we hold our ground?
And how do we hold our ground? Because what's concerning to me is that in this moment, as we're being cameras from above and around you, the police surrounding you, how are you supposed to demonstrate? If something untoward happens, can I trust with AI that the cameras are going to tell me the truth? I mean, I don't think that's a reach, because I've got Peter Thiel, who, when asked if the human race will endure, he could not answer.
Yeah.
In the affirmative, he stuttered and never said yes. Never said yes. Never, never. What are we to do in a moment like this? I mean,
Well,
because I mean, do you think that you would have been able to do what you did with Laquan McDonald? Do you think you'd be able to do that today in this moment?
it may be in this jurisdiction, yeah, I mean, I can certainly do the reporting. I don't feel,
Hmm.
I mean, I think it's just really important that people don't make premature concessions, right? And there was something said, but I've forgotten who it was, a writer in Latin America, living in Brazil or Argentina, living under an authoritarian regime, was reflecting back on how they resisted.
Hmm.
And he said something that I just find conceptually useful way of thinking. He said that we occupied every space where the state wasn't. We
Hmm.
occupied every space where the state wasn't. And to this right now, there's a lot of space in the society, even as we worry about ICE agents and the military coming into Chicago. There's lots and lots of space, and I think the key is to have the confidence not to take cover or make premature concessions. I think that that's really important. But there's something I want to come back to that you said, Santita, that suggests something interesting, which is how are people going to protest under these circumstances?
Hmm.
How are people going to protest under military occupation? Well, one of the things that's always fascinated me about about demonstrations in the so-called public forum, in the streets, the parks, civic spaces, is even though, especially in the Black Lives Matter era, the police were often the antagonists, sort of confronting the police. The police are also in a well-functioning city or jurisdiction. The police are also necessary to guarantee and protect the space in which you protest. You need the police, right? For a mass protest, the police, and especially if there's danger of provocateurs, if there's a danger of violent counterattacks, the police actually have an important role to play. And if they're not the antagonist, as in the Black Lives Matter moment, it's almost like they're ushers or facilitators of the exercise of First Amendment rights. They don't often play that role very well, but it really is their role.
That's their
And so,
codified role. I mean,
yeah, that's their codified role, to protect to manage public space in such a way as to give us as citizens optimal access and ability to express ourselves. And never has that role been more important when you have these military forces who are completely unaccountable to anybody but the president, as far as I can tell, and who actually are arguably meant to provoke violent reaction. So I think we need to be thinking about how we demand a really high level of sort of stewardship under the First Amendment of local police, because it's this complicated genre. There was a really interesting moment when the National Guard first went into LA, some months ago,
Mhm.
and nobody knew quite what was going to happen. It was a very chaotic situation. There was a mass demonstration, and the LAPD, the Los Angeles Police Department, got between the National Guard, who were around some federal facility, and demonstrators, and actually moved the demonstrators away the from the National Guard. They intervened and mediated, and arguably to protect the exercise of First Amendment rights and to keep some, um, messy disorder from happening. So I think, we've had all sorts of eloquence from the mayor, from the governor, which I welcome. But the real question is, will the Chicago Police Department step up and ensure that our First Amendment rights to demonstrate in public are protected, if need be, protected against the federal government?
I've not heard about that. What I would think that then that would have to come the instruction that you are to protect the public space. That you are to protect those who are demonstrating. We use. I think we need to be careful about the languaging that we
Yeah,
use, right? That
yeah,
they are demonstrating and their point of view, right?
right.
Peacefully. I do think the Chicago police have been told that.
This conversation is suggesting an article to me, which I think I'm going to undertake. I think so. After the mess, and it was particularly acute in Chicago in the George Floyd moment in 2020,
Mhm.
when there was kind of chaos in the city that the police did not manage very well, both in terms of legitimate demonstrations and criminal activity, folks who took advantage of the moment to loot. In Chicago and in multiple jurisdictions across the country that had similar problems, there were what are called after action reviews. The police department or inspector generals or some other civic entity did really, careful look backs. What are the lessons that we could learn from this messy situation? I'd be very, very curious. And I think at that moment, there was talk certainly of the kind of training that police officers need to perform that function under the First Amendment. I'd be really curious if that kind of
Mhm.
training really has occurred, and also just how they think about this moment.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, I'm wondering because these are people whose families are going to lose health care.
yeah,
Because really, when you look at the Pentagon memo that the Washington Post reported on a couple of weeks ago, this is in anticipation of after November 2026, which is when the cuts are supposed to hit. They're anticipating massive demonstrations, massive protests, most specifically.
yeah,
Because people, the Yale study says that 50,000 people will needlessly die at the very least in the United States.
the
You
numbers
know,
are shocking.
the numbers are shocking. And, and that's just baseline numbers. We don't know how many people, because a lot of people we saw through COVID were marginally well in the first place, because that's one
Yeah,
of the things that COVID exposed. It exposed just how unwell many of us are.
yeah.
Um, what what do you see? I mean, particularly in a city like Chicago that has this kind of history. And what Chicago did was expose a history that they have in New York, but no one really talks about it the way they talk about it in Chicago. It's a history that's in Los Angeles. Otherwise, Los Angeles would not have exploded the way it did in
Completely.
1992. I mean, it's part of the American. It's in the American DNA
It's the urban reality in
and
America,
and
but
in the
it's
world,
somehow,
right?
yeah, but somehow in Chicago, it's always, maybe it's because I mean, we're sort of
We're
provincials.
Chicagoans, so
This is the world we know, so I don't know if we've got a perspective, but I think there's always a sense in that these things are more kind of boldly defined and explicit in Chicago, which makes it, a compelling place to work on these issues because they're not hidden. But I think I want to come back to this because I think we've hatched a really important question, which is how is under these circumstances of occupation by the federal government, war against its own citizens, how is the Chicago Police Department thinking about protecting the First Amendment rights of
Mhm.
of Chicagoans, and what kind of training, what kind of practices, how are they operationalizing that? That's really interesting. I'm gonna follow up on that. I'll let you know what I find out.
I would love to know because what part of the one of the things that my parents saw in their endeavorings as they came into Chicago, they got here in 1964. And my mother saw as they were driving into the city, she saw these tall buildings. My mother is from Florida and Virginia,
Yeah,
and they came out of North Carolina in school. My
yeah,
father had spent time though in
yeah,
his formative years in Chicago because his aunts and uncles were here. Very interesting. So Chicago was not new to him, but he was coming to the University of Chicago for his graduate work. And she looked and she said, "Oh, Jesse, the city is so big. Look at this place. How will we make it here? Will anyone ever get to know us? I mean, what the, that's what, how ironic is that?" She
yeah.
said, she said, the city was so overwhelming to me. I just wondered, would we be able to make it in this city? This place is so big. And he said, I think we're going to be okay. Baby, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. But one of the things that as my father came here, he started organizing, which is how Dr. King had met him when he was in school because he was a student leader and he was the national vice president of his fraternity. This is the Divine Nine, huge fraternity. And so he had heard about this young man who was this mover and shaker, and this mover and shaker in Chicago, and a great organizer who was a student at the University of Chicago getting his master's in divinity, blah, blah, blah. And they ran up against this wall called Richard Daley,
Yeah,
Boss State. And my mother said one of the advantages for us in the context of SELC, Dr. King's organization, which is where they were from, she said we were not in Atlanta. We were in Chicago with James Bevel. C.T. Vivian was here. It was just a few of us in Chicago. But Chicago was where they did not want to come.
Yeah.
Because when Dr. King got here, he said, "This is the most hostile, these are the meanest people I've seen in my life." Bull Connor has nothing on the white people in Gage Park. I just, in Cicero, he said, "I've never seen anything like this."
Yeah.
And they learned not to call the name. They said, my mother said, we learned a lot from Richard Daley. One of the things we learned was not to call the name of our opponent.
Uh-huh.
You never do that.
You never
You
dignify them.
that's right. You stick to your point. And you also saw, she said, you had never seen a city this organized because he had organized down not to the block, but to the house and to the
Yeah.
apartment. He knew where every single vote was.
Yep.
And I think that's the advantage that, that gave you this long history of getting to that point that you saw. One of the things that Dr. King ran up against when he got here was just how organized everybody was. And Mayor Daley had everybody in
Yeah.
silos.
Including
And
the black wing of the machine, right?
including, they were the first. I
They were
mean,
the
these are people who praised him from afar, but when he got here,
yeah,
they absolutely shut him down.
yeah,
But that's Chicago too. I mean, because we still live with the overlay of the
yeah,
machine. Chicago's still an incredibly politically engaged and organized city. It is.
yeah.
And so it is in that context that I ask you about ICE and the FBI and the National Guard coming here. How is that going to work? I mean, because
I
I'm wondering if President Trump thought that he was going to get the pushback from a city that he's getting from Chicago.
Yeah, I think, I so I mean, in Trump world for a long time, Chicago has had this kind of um, symbolic profile as a city out of control. A black city, Democrat, as they say, they never say Democratic, it's Democrat city. Uh, you know, uh, Worse than Afghanistan, hell, here we are in this beautiful city, right? I mean, it's got
That
its
he wanted
problems.
to build in. I mean, really?
Yeah, it's got its problems, but it's a pretty extraordinary city that he's portraying as the worst place on earth, as this kind of hellhole. So you've got that disconnect, which I think is um, it's one thing when he's just running his mouth. When he actually has boots on the ground in Chicago,
Yeah.
and they're guarding the Bean in Millennium Park or something. I mean, who knows what this is going to look like? Right? I mean, so I don't think we want to lose our sense of humor in the course of this.
No. And I want people to know it's an actual chrome bean in the middle of downtown. It's beautiful. But I just want you to know it's one of our landmarks. It's for those of you who are not from
Oh, I'm
Chicago.
sorry for those. Yeah,
No,
not from
no, no,
Chicago.
it's okay. For those of me,
Yeah,
it's just because you wonder, is that what he's going to do? Because
yeah, and I think the other part of this is that sending troops. I mean, putting ICE aside, sending troops to LA was contested legally by the governor,
Mhm.
and that case is still working its way through the appellate process.
Mhm.
But there's strong reason to believe, and strong argument that he violated the law in fundamental law, constitutional law, in sending the troops absent a real emergency. And so you have that legal process pending. DC is different because it's not a state and the complicated relationship to the federal government. So there was slightly more grounds that could be argued for federal intervention there. Chicago, there's just no basis for. I mean, where's our emergency? What's the so it's a completely fictional. I mean, part of what Trump does, and it is fundamental to the authoritarian playbook, and we've seen it again and again, is you declare an emergency, a state of exception, and seize more and more power. And that is just almost laughable in Chicago at the moment. With if crime is the rationale for coming to Chicago, and the crime rate has post COVID has steadily gone down, continues to go down. So we have to watch what happens. It's unpredictable, and I think the real danger I see is less that we'll have a pervasive military presence in the city than you have people who aren't trained for law enforcement, right? I mean, they're trained for combat. They're not trained for law enforcement. And something happens. Some of your listeners will remember Kent State students.
But Jamie,
Kent State, yeah,
not to interrupt you, but that's what I'm doing. But but that's the point. These people are trained for combat.
Yeah.
They're not trained. I mean, can they even administer can they give you your Miranda rights, your right to remain silent? I mean, just your right to, to have a lawyer. I mean, can you even get that? What are they here to do?
Yeah. Apparently they can't do those things because most of the arrests are being thrown out in Washington. Grand juries are refusing to indict, and judges are kicking out the cases. So from a legal point of view, it's a debacle. It's a mess. But I don't think it's in any way intended as actual law enforcement. It's, again, an effort to dominate and to intimidate and to make us afraid.
Well, just moving forward, where do you see a Chicago as, do you think that we can become an example for the rest of the country about how this should be handled?
I hope so. I mean, Chicago has as you were referring to Dr. King's interval in Chicago, really complicated law enforcement history. We haven't talked about the police riot in 1968. We haven't, we've seen, we've seen military on our streets in our lifetimes. But I think the hope is to show how a mature democratic polity takes responsibility for its own safety. And one of the paradoxes in all of this is, and there's been some reporting on this, there's a lot of coordination and communication between blue state governors, blue state attorneys general, daily communication, coming up with sort of resistance strategies, mostly legal strategies for resisting the overreach of the administration. And one of the great paradoxes of our time is that it's now liberal and progressive folks at the state level who are looking to exploit the states' rights laws and mechanisms that were set up by segregationists to defeat integration. But now we're in a position to kind of flip the script. Right?
But don't we always? I mean, use the Constitution that declared people 3/5 human to make them free.
Yeah,
and you amended it. I mean, I guess life has all of those ironies, but you're right. I mean, and it's good to see these people come together. I just hate that it's on a partisan basis, because to me, there's some issues that are transpartisan, and this to me is that issue.
I think it is. It's going to be curious, and I don't for a moment claim to have an answer to this, but I just wonder if, with the kind of overreach we're seeing now, on both the immigration, enforcement front, and now this notion of coming to fight crime that's out of control in democratic cities, I'm wondering if some of this is going to affect people who are otherwise Trump supporters. Nobody voted for this, as far as I know, and for the form it's taking, and it's now beginning to reach into everybody's everyday lives. It's your babysitter, it's your gardener, it's your school's your kid's teacher, it's your neighbor who is being sent off to Uganda or to El Salvador, seized without due process, that begins to have a different feel to people who may generally, um, you know, um, vote in favor of immigration reform, but this kind of, dragnet sweeping up anybody and, only concerned about making numbers, um, is, I think, going to disturb a lot of people. So I think in answer to your question, I hope people keep their cool. I hope people keep their cool. I hope they keep their sense of humor. And I urge people to do everything they can to document whatever they witness. Think about,
Yeah. No, please,
yeah,
please,
I mean,
because that's a
yeah,
real,
I
that's
think
a
there's
very
a
real
power.
thing.
We've had 2 wars. We have 2 concurrent wars right now in the Ukraine and in Gaza that are appalling, just
Mhm.
horrific. Um, Most of what we know, much of what we know, arguably most of what we know, has been reported by the victim.
Mhm.
That
Mm.
social media has made it possible. Gaza is the most extreme example because of the level of the destruction. I mean, journalists are getting killed in Gaza. It's hard to get access. Most of what we know is coming from the victims, able to
Mhm.
report out, able to report out. I don't want to suggest for a moment anything remotely comparable to those horrific situations. But I think we can learn something in terms of our power to document what's happening, to share it widely, and to just be really wide awake and pay attention. And if there are opportunities for mass protests, I would urge people to participate. And I think those protests are all the more powerful if they're people who, um, never saw themselves as taking to the streets,
Mhm.
were to do so now, right? It's sort of, um, uh, folks who don't define themselves as particularly political or radical or anything, but, whatever their political affiliation, care about just fundamental decency and, respect for human rights. So, but most of all, I think it's staying cool. Saying we're gonna be in this for a long time, and we don't well, we're gonna be in it for a while, and, and something's gonna come after. Something's gonna come after, right? We don't know when that we turn that corner, and how we conduct ourselves now, how we are there for each other now, how we step up when we have the opportunities to resist as individuals and together with our neighbors. Those things they may not matter in the short term, but I think they're gonna matter in the long term.
Jamie Calvin, the Invisible Institute. Everybody get out there, be peaceful, and you make the brilliant point to document from our perspective.
Yeah.
You know, when my father ran for president, he said, this is a campaign not from the mansion down, but from not the mansion down, but the manger up.
Yeah. Well,
He's a
we
southerner.
when I started reporting around 2000, a quarter of a century ago from South State Street, from public housing,
Mhm.
we have sort of human rights documentation, and we called it the view from the ground.
There you go.
The view, I mean, and there is power in the view from the ground, and it's something that mainstream journalists can't do. The New York Times can't do it,
Mhm.
but citizens can do it.
Jamie Calvin, everybody, the Invisible Institute. I thank you so much for your work and for all this wisdom that you've given us today. I cannot wait to see what you're going to write next, what you're going to do next.
I've
I
got
love
something
it.
coming. I've got something coming. I'll let you know soon.
Let me know.
Okay.
Sending
Always
you
good.
much love. Always a blessing to be with Jamie Calvin and the Invisible Institute. I am Santita Jackson, AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. God bless.